somewhere in the heart of Cairo, in a climate-controlled gallery in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. Behind a glass case that separates the present from the ancient past, there is a face. The actual, physical, preserved face of a man who ruled the most militarily powerful, the most institutionally sophisticated, the most diplomatically influential, and the most culturally productive and artistically ambitious state in the entire ancient world for 66 consecutive years, and who died more than 3,200 years before the museum that now houses his remains was built. There is a face in a museum in Cairo, the face of a man who died more than 3,200 years ago, and the face is still recognizable. The nose is hooked and prominent, the jaw is strong. The hair, preserved by the chemicals of the mummification process and by the dry, stable air of the Theban hills, is reddish, faded by time but still visible, still carrying the color that the man wore in life. The skin is stretched tight over the bones, the lips are thin and drawn, the eyes are closed. But the face is a face, not a relic, not an abstraction, not a symbol of a vanished civilization, but the actual, physical, recognizable face of a specific human being who lived and ruled and built and fought and loved and buried his children and outlived his wives and sat on the throne of the most powerful state in the ancient world for 66 consecutive and extraordinarily productive years. Longer than almost any other ruler in the entire recorded history of human civilization, longer than the reigns of Louis XIV of France, Queen Victoria of England, or any Roman emperor, a span of time so vast that it contained within itself the equivalent of 2 or 3 normal human lifetimes, and that saw the birth, the maturity, and the death of nearly 3 complete generations of Egyptian subjects. The mummy was discovered in 1881 in the Great Royal Cache at Deir el-Bahari, the hidden tomb in the cliffs above the temple of Hatshepsut, where the priests of the 21st dynasty had secreted the bodies of more than 50 pharaohs, queens, and royal family members to protect them from the tomb robbers who were systematically plundering the Valley of the Kings. When the French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero unwrapped the mummy for the first time, he found himself looking at the face of a man who had clearly been formidable in life. A man of notably above-average height for an ancient Egyptian of his era, standing approximately 5 feet 7 inches, with a strong skeletal frame and features that conveyed authority and command even in death. The mummy showed the marks of extreme old age, severe arthritis in the joints, worn and abscessed teeth, healed fractures that spoke of injuries sustained decades before death, and the general deterioration of a body that had endured for nearly a century. But the face was remarkable, preserved with a fidelity that seemed almost miraculous, the features still sharp, still individual, still unmistakably those of a specific person rather than a generic type. The face belongs to Ramesses II. Ramesses the Great, Usermatra Setapenra, the 3rd pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, the man who erected more monuments, commissioned more statues, fathered more children, fought more campaigns, signed more treaties, and left a larger physical imprint on the landscape of Egypt than any other human being who has ever lived. His name is carved into the stone of more temples, more obelisks, more colossi, and more monuments than the name of any other pharaoh, carved so deeply and so frequently and so ubiquitously that 3,000 years of erosion, conquest, demolition, and neglect have not been able to erase it. His cartouches, the oval rings that contained his royal name, appear on monuments from the delta marshes of Lower Egypt to the sandstone cliffs of Nubia, from the Mediterranean coast to the cataracts of the Upper Nile, on temples and colossi and obelisks and stelae and statues that span a geographic range of more than 2,000 kilometers, and that represent, in their aggregate, the most extensive, the most sustained, the most comprehensively institutionally organized, and the most geographically comprehensive campaign of monumental self-commemoration and architectural self-glorification that any individual in the entire history of human civilization has ever conceived, initiated, and brought to completion. The sheer ubiquity of the name, the sheer frequency with which it appears, on surfaces large and small, in locations prominent and obscure, on monuments that Ramesses built, and on monuments that he merely claimed, is one of the most striking features of the Egyptian archaeological landscape, and one of the most historically revealing and psychologically significant indicators of the pharaoh's character and his priorities. Ramesses wanted to be everywhere, on every temple wall, on every obelisk, on every colossus, on every monument from the delta to the cataracts. He wanted his name on everything, on the buildings he constructed and on the buildings he merely claimed. He wanted the stone to carry his identity across the millennia, to speak his name to every generation that followed, to ensure that the world would never forget the man who had built more, fought more, and endured longer than any other human being who had ever lived. Ramesses II is, by any quantitative measure, the most prolific, the most organizationally ambitious, the most institutionally supported, and the most geographically far-reaching builder in the entire recorded history of human civilization. A man whose architectural output exceeded the combined output of many entire dynasties, whose monuments, even in their ruined and fragmentary state, continue to dominate the archaeological landscape of the Nile Valley, from the delta to the cataracts of Nubia. The numbers are striking. He reigned for 66 years, from approximately 1279 to 1213 BC. He fathered at least 100 children. The names of approximately 48 sons and more than 50 daughters are recorded on the walls of temples and tombs across Egypt by at least 8 official wives and an unknown number of secondary wives and concubines. The sheer number of Ramesses' offspring created both opportunities and challenges for the dynasty. The sheer abundance of royal princes ensured that there would always be a potential heir available to inherit the throne, but the competition among the princes for position and influence created internal tensions that would eventually contribute to the instability of the late Ramesside period. The tomb KV5 in the Valley of the Kings, rediscovered in 1995 by the American Egyptologist Kent Weeks and still under excavation, appears to have been a massive, multi-chambered burial complex designed to house the remains of many of Ramesses' sons. The tomb is one of the largest in the Valley of the Kings, with more than 120 chambers and corridors identified to date, and its excavation has been one of the most significant archaeological events of the past several decades. He fathered at least 100 children by at least 8 official wives and an unknown number of concubines. He conducted at least 15 military campaigns across 3 continents. He built or expanded temples at Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, Memphis, Abu Simbel, and dozens of other sites across Egypt and Nubia. He constructed an entirely new capital city, Pi-Ramesses, in the eastern Nile Delta, that became one of the largest, the most politically important, the most commercially active, and the most magnificently appointed cities in the entire ancient world. He signed what is widely recognized as the first known and most comprehensively documented peace treaty in all of recorded history, a comprehensive bilateral agreement with the powerful Hittite empire that ended decades of costly, inconclusive, and strategically destabilizing warfare, and that established a framework of diplomatic relations that lasted for generations. And he lived to be approximately 90 years old, an almost unimaginable lifespan in a world where the average life expectancy at birth was roughly 35 years, and where surviving to the age of 60 was itself considered remarkable, outliving most of his wives, most of his children, and the first 12 of his designated heirs. The scale of Ramesses' legacy is difficult to comprehend from written descriptions. It must be experienced, walked through, stood beneath, looked up at, to be even partially understood. The colossi at Abu Simbel, 4-seated figures, each one 20 meters tall, carved from the living rock of a Nubian cliff, are among the most visually overwhelming monuments in the history of human civilization. The hypostyle hall at Karnak, 134 columns covering 5,000 square meters, is one of the most impressive, the most architecturally ambitious, and the most visually overwhelming interior spaces ever created by human hands. The Ramesseum, his mortuary temple on the west bank at Thebes, with its fallen colossus that inspired Shelley's Ozymandias, is one of the most evocative ruins in all of Egypt, and the peace treaty with the Hittites, the oldest surviving, the most comprehensively documented, and the most diplomatically sophisticated peace treaty in the entire recorded history of human civilization. A document that addresses issues of sovereignty, mutual defense, refugee extradition, and the divine sanctioning of international agreements with a precision and a thoroughness that would be impressive in any historical era. Is one of the most historically significant diplomatic documents ever produced. Ramesses II was not merely a pharaoh, he was a phenomenon. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand who Ramesses II was, not the simplified great pharaoh of popular history, not the generic colossus of the tourist postcards, but the specific, complex, historically consequential man who inherited a kingdom from his father Seti I and who transformed it through military ambition, diplomatic calculation, and an almost pathological, seemingly inexhaustible, and historically unprecedented compulsion to build into the most architecturally magnificent and the most internationally powerful state in the ancient world. You are going to understand what he built, why he built it, what it cost, and what it means, not merely for the history of ancient Egypt, but for anyone who has ever looked at a monument and wondered whether the human desire to be remembered is ultimately a form of greatness, a form of vanity, or something more complex and more humanly affecting than either of those simple categories can contain. The story of Ramesses II is the story of the most ambitious attempt to defeat death that any individual human being has ever undertaken. An attempt that mobilized the virtually unlimited material resources, the vast institutional apparatus, and the enormous labor force of the most powerful state in the entire ancient world that consumed the labor of thousands of artisans and the wealth of an entire empire, and that produced, over the course of 66 years, the most extensive, the most geographically far-reaching, and the most numerically overwhelming collection of monuments, statues, temples, obelisks, and inscriptions that any single human being has ever created. The attempt succeeded. Ramesses is remembered, his name endures, his face is recognized. But the attempt also failed, because the man behind the monuments is dust and silence. The dynasty that he founded has been extinct for more than 3 millennia, and the civilization that built them is irrevocably gone. And the eternity that the pharaoh was promised by his gods and his priests, and the art on the walls of his tomb has not materialized. The monuments stand. The man is gone. And the question of whether the monuments are sufficient, whether the stone can carry the spirit, whether the carved name can substitute for the living breath, is a question that Ramesses' story poses with a clarity and a poignancy that no other story in the history of the ancient world can match. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin the journey into the life and the extraordinary legacy of the greatest builder that the ancient world, or indeed any world, ever produced. The man who would become the most prolific builder in human history was born around 1303 BC, the second son of the pharaoh Seti I and the influential Queen Tuya. His grandfather, Ramesses I, had been a career military officer, a commoner of no particular distinction who had risen, through merit and determination, through the ranks of the Egyptian professional army, to become the vizier of the pharaoh Horemheb, and who had been appointed by the childless Horemheb as his successor, founding the 19th dynasty and elevating his family from the obscurity of non-royal origins to the pinnacle of the Egyptian state. The family's origins were not royal. They were military, provincial, and undistinguished by the standards of the great dynasties that had preceded them. The Ramesses family had risen to prominence not through the accident of birth, but through the accumulation of military merit and political service, a trajectory that was unusual in the Egyptian system and that gave the new dynasty a distinctive character, a character marked by military confidence, administrative competence, and an almost obsessive concern with legitimacy that reflected the family's awareness of its non-royal origins and its determination to compensate for those origins through the visible and demonstrable exercise of pharaonic power. The dynasty was, at the time of Ramesses' birth, only 1 generation old, new, untested, and still in the process of establishing the unquestioned legitimacy that centuries of continuous royal lineage and divinely sanctioned succession would have automatically and effortlessly conferred. Ramesses' father, Seti I, was the man who had begun the work of transforming the new dynasty into a credible and culturally confident ruling house. Seti had launched military campaigns that reopened the trade routes to the Levant, captured the strategic city of Kadesh from the Hittites, begun the construction of the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, built the magnificent temple at Abydos, and created the most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Kings, KV 17, a masterpiece of funerary art that would never be surpassed. Seti had also done something that would prove decisive for the future of the dynasty. He had designated his son Ramesses as his co-regent and crown prince at the age of approximately 14, bringing the young man into the direct, practical, and increasingly responsible exercise of royal authority from a remarkably early age, and training him in the arts of warfare, diplomacy, and governance that the throne would demand. The designation of Ramesses as co-regent and crown prince at such a young age was a deliberate and strategically calculated decision, a decision that reflected Seti's understanding of the political realities of the Egyptian succession system and his determination to ensure that the transition of power from one generation to the next would be smooth, orderly, and constitutionally legitimate. The co-regency gave the young Ramesses direct experience of the exercise of royal authority. He participated in state ceremonies, he received foreign delegations, he oversaw administrative functions, and he gradually assumed the responsibilities that would prepare him for the full exercise of pharaonic power. The co-regency also served a political purpose. It established Ramesses' legitimacy in the eyes of the court, the army, the priesthood, and the population, ensuring that when the time came for the transfer of power, no rival, no competing prince, and no ambitious courtier would be in a position to credibly challenge his legitimate claim to the throne. The young Ramesses accompanied his father on actual military campaigns in the field, travelling to the western desert of Libya at approximately 14, and later to the strategically contested territories of Syria for the celebrated military campaign against the powerful Hittites at the fortified city of Kadesh. The education was deliberate, systematic, and comprehensively designed. Seti was preparing his son not merely to succeed him but to surpass him, to build on the foundations that Seti had laid, and to complete the transformation of the 19th dynasty from a new and still insecure ruling house into the most powerful and most culturally productive dynasty in the history of the Egyptian state. The relationship between Seti and Ramesses, between the father who built the most beautiful and the son who would build the most colossal, is one of the great father-son relationships of the ancient world, a relationship of preparation, transmission, and legacy that spans the momentous transition from one generation of pharaonic leadership to the next. The relationship between Seti and Ramesses was not merely one of instruction, it was one of shared experience, shared danger, and shared ambition. The young Ramesses had stood beside his father on the battlefield at Kadesh, had witnessed the Egyptian army engaging the Hittite forces, had seen the reality of war, the dust, the noise, the chaos of chariot combat, the screams of the wounded and the dying, and had learned, from first-hand observation, both the power and the limitations of Egyptian military force. The education was invaluable. It gave the young prince a practical understanding of warfare that no amount of theoretical instruction could have provided, and it shaped his approach to military affairs for the rest of his career. Seti died unexpectedly, probably in his early 40s, from what modern medical analysis suggests was a vascular disease. The death was premature. Seti's building projects were unfinished, his military campaigns were ongoing, and his vision for the dynasty was only partially realized. The death of Seti left the 19th dynasty in a vulnerable position. The founder's grandson, still a young man, untested as a sole ruler, inheriting a kingdom whose military situation was unresolved, whose building projects were incomplete, and whose dynastic legitimacy was still not fully established. The succession was smooth. Seti had ensured that through the co-regency, but the challenges that faced the new and still relatively untested young pharaoh were formidable, urgent, militarily pressing, strategically complex, and historically consequential. The Hittites remained a powerful and aggressive rival. The Levantine territories required constant military attention. The building projects needed to be completed, and the dynasty's legitimacy. The claim that the Ramesside pharaohs were divinely appointed rulers, rather than merely the descendants of a commoner who had been promoted to the throne, needed to be demonstrated through visible, dramatic, and overwhelming displays of power and achievement. The completion of that vision fell to his son, the young Ramesses, who ascended the throne at approximately the age of 24, and who would spend the next extraordinary 66 years, the next two-thirds of a century, building, fighting, negotiating, procreating, and transforming the physical landscape of Egypt on a scale that no previous pharaoh had attempted, and that no subsequent pharaoh would ever match or even seriously attempt to rival. When Ramesses took the throne, he was a young man in his mid-20s, energetic, ambitious, physically vigorous, and already experienced in the realities of military command and diplomatic negotiation. He had been his father's co-regent for the final years of Seti's reign, and the transition of power was smooth. The administrative apparatus of the Egyptian state continued to function without interruption. The military establishment maintained its readiness, and the major building projects that Seti had initiated at Karnak, Abydos, and other sites continued without interruption under the new pharaoh's enthusiastic direction. But Ramesses was not content merely to continue his father's work. He was determined to surpass it, to build bigger, to fight harder, to make his mark on the Egyptian landscape with an intensity and a scale that would ensure that his name would be remembered for as long as the stone endured and the Nile continued to flow. The first years of Ramesses's reign were devoted to the consolidation of power and the assertion of military authority. In his second year, he defeated a fleet of Sherdun pirates who had been attacking Egyptian cargo vessels in the Mediterranean, a brilliant tactical operation in which Ramesses posted troops and ships at strategic points along the coast, allowed the pirates to attack apparently vulnerable targets, and then sprung the trap, capturing the entire pirate fleet in a single action. The operation against the Sherdun was the first major, publicly celebrated military success of Ramesses's young reign, a victory that demonstrated the young pharaoh's considerable tactical ingenuity, his willingness to take bold and carefully calculated risks, and his ability to think strategically about the defense of Egypt's maritime interests. The Sherdun were one of the groups that later scholars would identify as part of the Sea Peoples, the mysterious coalition of maritime raiders who would, a generation later, devastate the eastern Mediterranean and contribute to the collapse of the Bronze Age civilization that Ramesses's Egypt represented. Ramesses's defeat of the Sherdun was, in retrospect, an early engagement in a much larger conflict, a conflict between the established land-based empires of the Bronze Age and the Theban raiders, who would eventually bring those empires to their knees. The captured Sherdun were not executed. They were recruited into Ramesses's personal bodyguard, a pragmatic decision that transformed potential enemies into loyal protectors, and that demonstrated the young pharaoh's characteristic combination of military aggression and political calculation. In his fourth year, Ramesses launched his first major campaign into the Levant, recapturing the territory of Amurru, which had been lost to the Hittites since the aftermath of his father's campaigns. The campaign was successful. Amurru was restored to Egyptian control, but it was also a provocation, a direct and deliberately provocative challenge to the powerful Hittite empire's carefully maintained, aggressively defended, diplomatically non-negotiable, and strategically vital sphere of influence in strategically vital northern Syria that would lead, the following year, to the most famous and most consequential military engagement of Ramesses's entire long career, and one of the most celebrated, most frequently depicted, and most extensively documented battles in the entire history of the ancient world. The Battle of Kadesh, fought in the fifth year of Ramesses's reign, around 1274 BC, near the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River in what is now Syria, was one of the largest chariot battles in recorded history. The scale of the Egyptian military mobilization for the Kadesh campaign was enormous, the largest, the most comprehensively organized and the most logistically ambitious military force that the Egyptian state had fielded in several generations, a force that represented the full, formidable, and comprehensively mobilized military potential of the most powerful state in the entire ancient world. The Egyptian army, organized into 4 divisions named after the gods Amun, Re, Ptah, and Seth, each consisting of approximately 5,000 men, a mix of infantry armed with spears, swords, and bows, chariotry operating the fast, lightweight 2-man chariots that were the principal offensive weapon of the Egyptian army, and support troops responsible for logistics, camp construction, and supply management, plus a contingent of Nubian auxiliaries and the formidable Shurden mercenaries who had been captured, recruited, and retrained during the pirate campaign of Ramesses' second year, marched north from Egypt through the Levantine corridor, numbering approximately 20,000 men and supported by more than 2,000 chariots. The Hittite army, under the command of King Muwatalli II, was at least equally large and included contingents from the Hittite Empire's numerous vassal states and allies, a coalition force that represented the combined and formidable military resources of the most powerful empire in Anatolia and the Near East. The battle itself was a near catastrophe for Ramesses. The Egyptian advance guard, led by the Amun division with Ramesses at its head, had been deceived by Hittite agents posing as deserters, who reported that the main Hittite army was located far to the north, near the city of Aleppo, and posed no immediate threat to the Egyptian advance. The intelligence was false. The agents were Hittite spies, sent by King Muwatalli to deceive the Egyptian command and to lure the Egyptian army into a position of vulnerability. The deception was a masterpiece of military intelligence, a classic example of the use of false information to manipulate an enemy's tactical decisions and to create the conditions for a devastating surprise attack. In reality, the Hittites were concealed behind the city of Kadesh, their army deployed in a carefully prepared ambush position, waiting for the Egyptian advance to extend itself along the march route and to create the gaps and the vulnerabilities that the Hittite chariots would exploit. The deception was brilliant, a classic intelligence operation that succeeded in manipulating the Egyptian command's understanding of the battlefield, and that created the conditions for a devastating surprise attack. Ramesses had fallen for the trap, and the consequences were nearly fatal. When the concealed Hittite chariot force, a massive, disciplined, tactically coordinated, and devastatingly effective strike force of thousands of chariots, each one carrying a driver and 2 warriors armed with javelins and short swords, crashed into the flank of the Re division, the result was catastrophic. The Egyptian division was caught on the march, strung out along the road, unprepared for combat, and the Hittite charge shattered it completely, scattering the Egyptian infantry across the landscape and sending the survivors fleeing northward in panic. The surviving soldiers of the Re division fled northward, carrying panic into the camp of the Amun division, where Ramesses was headquartered. Within minutes, the pharaoh found himself in the most dangerous, the most desperate, and the most personally threatening situation of his entire military career. His army in disarray, the Hittite chariots penetrating his camp, his bodyguard the only force between him and annihilation. When the Egyptian Re division, marching some distance behind the Amun division, was hit by a massive, devastating, and tactically brilliant chariot charge from the concealed Hittite forces, the division was shattered, and the fleeing survivors carried panic into the Amun division's camp. Ramesses found himself surrounded and in mortal danger, his army in complete disarray, his infantry divisions scattered across the landscape, his supply train overrun, and the formidable Hittite chariot corps closing in from multiple directions with devastating speed and overwhelming numerical superiority. The situation was desperate, and the ancient Egyptian texts make no attempt to disguise the severity of the crisis. The Bulletin, one of the 2 official accounts of the battle, describes the moment with extraordinary vividness. The pharaoh, surrounded by enemies, his army scattered, his officers nowhere to be found, calling upon the god Amun for help and receiving divine assistance in the form of supernatural strength and courage. The account is, of course, propagandistic, designed to present the pharaoh as a divinely favored warrior rather than as a commander who had been deceived by the enemy's intelligence operations and who had led his army into an ambush. But the underlying military reality, the reality of a pharaoh who found himself surrounded and outnumbered and who fought his way out through personal courage and tactical skill, is not implausible. And many professional military historians and scholars of ancient warfare have accepted the broad outlines of the Egyptian account as plausible. The scenario of a commander who was deceived by enemy intelligence, who found himself cut off from his main force, and who personally led a counterattack that stabilized the situation, is consistent with known patterns of ancient chariot warfare and is not implausible given the military conditions of the 13th century BC. The Battle of Kadesh has been studied by military historians not merely for its historical significance, but for its tactical lessons. The dangers of inadequate intelligence, the vulnerability of strung-out march columns to flank attacks, the importance of reserves, and the potentially decisive and battle-changing impact that the personal leadership, the physical presence, and the moral authority of a commander can have on the outcome of a desperate and seemingly lost battle. The battle remains, more than 3,000 years after it was fought, one of the most extensively studied, the most frequently debated, and the most exhaustively analysed military engagements in the entire ancient world, and its detailed depiction in the remarkably detailed Kadesh inscriptions has given military historians and scholars of ancient warfare an extraordinary and unparalleled window into the realities of Bronze Age warfare while dismissing the supernatural elements. What happened next became the defining moment of Ramesses' reign and one of the most celebrated, most frequently depicted, and most enduringly famous military episodes in the entire history of Egyptian civilization. Ramesses personally rallied his bodyguard and his immediate retainers, mounted his chariot, and led a desperate counterattack against the Hittite forces that had penetrated the Egyptian camp. The counterattack was fierce enough to stabilize the situation until the timely arrival of a fifth Egyptian force, the Niarin, a corps of elite troops that had been traveling by a different route, turned the tide of the battle. The Hittites withdrew across the Orontes River, and the battle ended in a tactical stalemate. Neither side had achieved a decisive victory, and both armies withdrew from the field. The aftermath of the battle, the immediate military aftermath, before the propaganda machine began its work of transformation, was sobering for both sides. The Egyptian army had nearly been destroyed. The Re division had been shattered. The Ammon division's camp had been overrun, and only the timely arrival of the Niarin and the personal courage of the pharaoh had prevented a catastrophic defeat. The Hittites, for their part, had failed to exploit their initial advantage. The chariot charge that had shattered the Re division had not been followed up with sufficient infantry support, and the Hittite charioteers who had penetrated the Egyptian camp had dispersed to loot the tents, rather than pressing the attack against the rallying Egyptian forces. The result was that both sides had demonstrated their strengths and their weaknesses. The Egyptians had shown their vulnerability to deception and their dependence on the personal leadership of the pharaoh, and the Hittites had demonstrated their tactical inability to sustain a coordinated combined arms offensive beyond the initial devastating chariot charge, and their failure to convert tactical surprise into strategic victory. The stalemate at Kadesh was, by any objective military assessment, an inconclusive result, a battle that neither side won, and that left the strategic situation in northern Syria essentially unchanged. But Ramesses did not present it as a stalemate. He presented it as a glorious victory, a personal triumph of the pharaoh over overwhelming odds, a demonstration of divine favor and superhuman courage that proved Ramesses' status as a living god and a warrior without equal. The account of the battle, known as the Poem of Pentor and the Bulletin, was inscribed on the walls of temples across Egypt, from Karnak to Abu Simbel, in one of the most extensive, most sophisticated, and most geographically comprehensive propaganda campaigns in the entire history of the ancient world. The propaganda campaign that followed the Battle of Kadesh was one of the most extensive and most sophisticated in the history of the ancient world. A sustained, multimedia, geographically comprehensive campaign of self-promotion that used every tool available to the Egyptian state to transform a military stalemate, a battle that neither side won and that left the strategic situation essentially unchanged, into a compelling, theologically coherent, and visually spectacular narrative of divine triumph. The account of the battle was inscribed on the walls of temples at Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, Abu Simbel, and the Ramesseum, on every major religious monument in the Egyptian state, ensuring that every priest, every official, every literate visitor to these temples would encounter the pharaoh's version of events and would absorb the narrative of Ramesses's superhuman courage and divine favor. The account was composed in two forms: the bulletin, a relatively straightforward and factually detailed military dispatch that describes the battle's events in relatively factual terms, and the poem of Pentor, a literary composition that presents the battle as an epic of personal heroism, with the pharaoh calling upon the god Amun for help and receiving divine assistance in the form of supernatural strength and courage. The two texts complement each other. The bulletin provides the essential military context, the tactical details, and the factual framework, and the poem provides the theological interpretation, the divine narrative, and the emotional drama, and together they create a narrative that is simultaneously a military report and a religious testament, a document that serves both the immediate political needs and the long-term theological requirements of the pharaoh's comprehensive, multi-dimensional, and theologically elaborate self-presentation. The inscriptions depict Ramesses single-handedly routing the Hittite army, his chariot plunging into the enemy ranks, his arrows finding their targets with divine accuracy, the enemy fleeing before the wrath of the pharaoh god. The reality was considerably more nuanced. The pharaoh had fought with genuine courage, but the battle had been a near disaster that was saved by the timely arrival of reinforcements rather than by the supernatural intervention of the gods. But the reality was not the point. The point was the narrative, the interpretation, the theological framework within which the events were presented and understood. In the Egyptian theological system, the pharaoh was, according to the fundamental theology of the Egyptian state, a god, the living, breathing, and physically present incarnation of the falcon god Horus, the divine mediator and the cosmic bridge between the human world and the world of the gods. A god could not lose a battle. A god could not be outmaneuvered. A god could not be deceived by enemy intelligence. A god could not lead his army into an ambush. Therefore, the Battle of Kadesh had to be presented not as a military stalemate, but as a divine triumph. A victory of the God-King over the forces of chaos and disorder, a reaffirmation of the cosmic order of Ma'at, a demonstration that the pharaoh's inherent and divinely bestowed nature guaranteed his ultimate and inevitable victory, regardless of the immediate circumstances, the tactical setbacks, or the numerical odds of the battlefield. The reality was considerably more nuanced, but the reality was not the point. The point was the narrative, the story, the version of events that would be carved into stone and preserved for eternity. The Battle of Kadesh did not end the conflict between Egypt and the Hittites. It merely inaugurated a new phase, a prolonged period of military competition, diplomatic maneuvering, and proxy warfare that would continue for the next 16 years. Ramesses conducted additional campaigns in the Levant during this period, campaigns that are less well documented than Kadesh, but that were part of a sustained, determined, and militarily costly effort to assert, to maintain, and to extend Egyptian authority in a region that both Egypt and the Hittites claimed as their sphere of influence. The campaigns were partially successful. Ramesses held Amuru, maintained control over the coastal cities of Phoenicia, and projected Egyptian power deep into the Levantine corridor. But the Hittites retained control of Kadesh and of northern Syria, and the fundamental strategic reality, the division of the Levant into Egyptian and Hittite spheres of influence, remained essentially unchanged. The resolution of the Egyptian-Hittite conflict came not through military victory but through diplomacy, and the diplomatic solution that Ramesses and the Hittite king Hattusili III negotiated in the 21st year of Ramesses's reign is one of the most historically significant documents in the entire history of human civilization. The circumstances that led to the treaty were complex and involved changes on both sides of the conflict. The Hittite Empire had been weakened by internal political struggles. Hattusili III had seized the Hittite throne from his nephew Mursili III in a palace coup that had destabilized the Hittite royal court and that had created internal enemies who threatened the new king's position. The Hittites also faced a growing threat from the Assyrian Empire to their east, a rising power that was beginning to challenge Hittite control of the trade routes of northern Mesopotamia. Egypt, for its part, had achieved its principal strategic objectives: the maintenance of its sphere of influence in the southern Levant and the security of the trade routes that connected the Nile Valley to the markets of the ancient Near East. Both sides had reasons to prefer peace to continued warfare, and both sides had the political will and the diplomatic sophistication, the political maturity, and the strategic vision to negotiate a comprehensive settlement that addressed the interests and the concerns of both parties. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, dated to approximately 1258 BC, is the oldest surviving peace treaty in recorded history, a bilateral agreement between two great powers that established the terms of a permanent peace, defined the boundaries between their respective spheres of influence, provided for mutual military assistance in the event of attack by a third party, a mutual defense clause that was extraordinary in its scope, and that committed both empires to come to each other's aid in the event of aggression by any outside power. The treaty also included provisions for the extradition of political refugees who fled from one empire to the other, a clause that was controversial even in the ancient world and that reflected the pragmatic, realpolitik character of the agreement. The language of the treaty is remarkably modern in its structure and its concerns. It addresses issues of sovereignty, borders, mutual defense, and the resolution of disputes in terms that a modern diplomat would recognize. The treaty also included a divine sanction clause. Both sides invoked their respective gods as witnesses to the agreement, and the text explicitly and solemnly specifies that any party that knowingly and deliberately violated the sacred terms of the treaty would face severe and inescapable divine punishment from the gods of both nations. The combination of practical, diplomatic provisions and theological sanctions reflects the distinctive character of ancient Near Eastern diplomacy, in which the political and the religious were inextricably intertwined, and included provisions for the extradition of political refugees. The treaty was inscribed in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform. The Egyptian version was prominently carved on the walls of the great state temple of Karnak, while the Hittite version, inscribed on a now-lost silver tablet whose text was copied onto clay tablets, was recovered from the extensive diplomatic archives of the Hittite capital at Hattusa. The preservation of the treaty in both Egyptian and Hittite versions, and the remarkable degree of correspondence between the two versions, despite the differences in language, script, and diplomatic conventions, has given scholars an extraordinary window into the diplomatic practices of the ancient Near East and into the mechanisms by which great powers resolved their conflicts in the Bronze Age. The treaty is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a document of genuine diplomatic sophistication, a text that addresses the complex and competing interests of two great empires with a precision and a thoroughness that would be impressive in any era. The mutual defense clause, the extradition provisions, the invocation of divine witnesses, and the provision for the review and the renewal of the agreement all demonstrate a level of diplomatic maturity that challenges the common assumption that the diplomacy of the ancient world was primitive or unsophisticated. A copy of the treaty now hangs in the United Nations headquarters in New York, a symbol of the antiquity and the universality of the human aspirations to resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than through force. The signing of the peace treaty marked a fundamental shift in Ramesses's reign, a shift from the military phase to the building phase, from the sword to the chisel, from the chariot to the construction site. The first 2 decades of Ramesses's reign had been dominated by warfare: the Shurdan pirates, the Levantine campaigns, the Battle of Kadesh, the 16 years of inconclusive warfare that followed. The peace treaty ended the warfare and freed Ramesses to devote the remaining 4.5 decades of his reign to the activity that would define his legacy more than any military campaign: building. The scale of the building program that Ramesses launched after the peace treaty is difficult to overstate. It was as if the enormous energy, the boundless ambition, the vast financial resources, and the extraordinary organizational capacity that had been devoted to warfare were suddenly redirected to construction, and the result was an explosion of monumental architecture that transformed the physical, visual, and monumental landscape of Egypt on a scale and with an intensity that no previous pharaoh had ever attempted or even conceived. The peace treaty with the Hittites was not merely a diplomatic achievement. It was a strategic transformation that reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East, and that freed Ramesses to devote the remaining decades of his reign to the vast, comprehensive, and historically unprecedented building program that would make him, within a few decades, the most prolific, the most geographically ubiquitous, the most imperially funded, the most lavishly resourced, the most comprehensively institutionally supported, and the most monumentally ambitious builder in the entire recorded history of human civilization. The treaty was sealed by a diplomatic marriage. Ramesses married a Hittite princess, the daughter of Hattusili III, in a ceremony that was celebrated in Egypt as a great event, and that was commemorated in inscriptions at Abu Simbel and other sites. The Hittite princess, who received the Egyptian name Marthor-Neferua upon her arrival in Egypt, was escorted from Hattusa to the Egyptian border by a massive, richly equipped entourage that included Hittite court officials, priests, soldiers, attendants, and servants, and she was received by Ramesses with the ceremony and the pomp that befitted the daughter of a great king and the bride of an even greater one. The marriage was celebrated in inscriptions at Abu Simbel and Karnak, inscriptions that describe the Hittite princess's beauty, the magnificence of the wedding celebrations, and the joy of the Egyptian people at the union of the two great empires. The marriage of the Hittite princess to Ramesses was one of the most significant diplomatic events of the 13th century BC, an event that symbolized the end of decades of warfare between the two greatest, most militarily powerful, and most diplomatically sophisticated powers of the ancient Near East, and that established a framework of personal and dynastic connection between the two royal families that would endure for the remainder of the century. The princess arrived in Egypt with an enormous dowry: gold, silver, horses, cattle, and slaves, and she was received by Ramesses with a ceremony, a pomp, and a magnificence that reflected the importance of the event and the pharaoh's entirely characteristic and predictable desire to present the diplomatically negotiated marriage as a magnificent and glorious triumph of Egyptian diplomacy and a demonstration of the irresistible attraction of Egyptian civilization. The inscriptions are, characteristically, presented entirely from the Egyptian perspective. The Hittites are depicted as grateful supplicants who offered their princess to the mighty pharaoh as a gesture of submission rather than as equal partners in a diplomatic arrangement. The reality was more balanced. The marriage was a mutual agreement between two powers that recognized each other's strength and that sought to cement their alliance through the most durable form of diplomatic bond available in the ancient world. The marriage was political, a visible and personal symbol of the newly forged alliance between the two great empires. But it was also practical, a guarantee of good faith that bound the two royal families together and that created a personal connection between the two courts that transcended the formal terms of the treaty. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that lies at the heart of the story of Ramesses II, and that makes his legacy one of the most complex and most debated in the history of Egyptology. Ramesses was a builder, the greatest builder in the history of the pharaonic state, but he was also a usurper, a man who systematically appropriated the monuments of his predecessors, who carved his name over the names of earlier pharaohs, who claimed credit for buildings he did not build, and achievements he did not accomplish. The practice of usurpation. The erasure of one pharaoh's name and its replacement with another's was not new to the 19th dynasty. Horemheb had done it, Seti had done it, but Ramesses did it on a scale that dwarfed anything his predecessors had attempted. He systematically and comprehensively usurped monuments spanning the entire chronological range from the Old Kingdom to the late 18th dynasty, carving his cartouches over the names of pharaohs who had lived centuries and even millennia before him, claiming their buildings, their statues, and their achievements as his own. The practice of usurpation was deeply controversial among the 19th century Egyptologists who first identified it. Scholars who had traveled to Egypt expecting to find the monuments of the pharaohs intact and who discovered, to their dismay, that many of the most visually impressive and most historically significant monuments bore the deeply carved cartouches of Ramesses over the erased cartouches of earlier rulers. The scholar who first systematically documented the practice, noting the differences in style, technique, and quality between the original carvings and the replacement cartouches, described Ramesses as the Great Usurper, a designation that has stuck in the scholarly literature and that captures both the scale and the audacity of the practice. The Egyptologist John Romer has noted that Ramesses's usurpation was not random. It was systematic, targeted, and strategically calculated, focusing on the most visible, the most impressive, and the most publicly accessible monuments, and leaving the lesser, less prominent monuments untouched and unaltered. The strategy was efficient, maximum impact for minimum effort. The usurpation was not merely political, it was also practical. Ramesses understood that the fastest and the most cost-effective way to acquire a monument was not to build one from scratch, but to appropriate one that already existed. The economics of usurpation were compelling. A colossal statue that might take a team of sculptors several years to quarry, transport, carve, and erect could be claimed by Ramesses through the simple expedient of recarving the cartouches, an operation that required a small team of skilled stonemasons working for a few days. The cost savings were enormous. Usurpation gave Ramesses the visual impact of a monumental building program at a fraction of the cost of genuine construction. A statue that took a previous pharaoh years to commission, carve, and erect could be claimed by Ramesses in a single afternoon. All it required was a small but skilled team of experienced stonemasons to carefully chisel out the old cartouches and replace them with the new ones. The practice was efficient, it was economical, and it multiplied Ramesses's visible presence across the Egyptian landscape far beyond what new construction alone could have achieved. But the practice also raises uncomfortable but historically important questions about the authenticity and the integrity of Ramesses's architectural legacy. Questions about how much of what bears his name was actually built by him, and how much was merely claimed by him. Questions about the relationship between genuine creation and systematic appropriation, between artistic originality and political usurpation, between the builder and the brand. And it gets worse. Ramesses did not merely usurp the monuments of his predecessors. He also adopted a technique of carving that made future usurpation of his own monuments virtually impossible. Previous pharaohs had typically used raised relief, the technique in which the background stone was cut away to leave the figures standing proud of the surface, or shallow sunken relief, in which the figures were cut into the surface of the stone to a modest depth. The 19th century Egyptologists who first studied the phenomenon of usurpation were struck by the cleverness and the foresight of Ramesses's approach. The deep sunken relief that he employed was not merely an artistic choice. It was a strategic decision, a calculation about the permanence of his legacy that reflected the same kind of forward-thinking pragmatism that characterized his diplomatic and military strategies. Ramesses understood that the monuments he claimed would be targets for future usurpers. Just as he himself had usurped the monuments of his predecessors, so future pharaohs might attempt to usurp his. The deep carving was his defense against this possibility, a guarantee that his name, once inscribed, could not be removed without destroying the entire relief, a level of effort that would make usurpation impractical, and that would ensure the survival of his cartouches for as long as the stone itself endured. Ramesses ordered his sculptors to use deep sunken relief, carving his cartouches and his images so deeply into the stone that no subsequent pharaoh could erase them without destroying the entire surface. The deep carving technique was not merely practical. It also had an aesthetic impact that was significant and that distinguishes Ramesses's monuments from those of his predecessors. The deeply cut reliefs cast sharp, dramatic shadows in the strong Egyptian sunlight, creating a visual effect that was bolder, more dramatic, and more visually arresting than the shallow, delicate raised relief that Seti and other earlier pharaohs had favored. The deep shadows gave the inscriptions a three-dimensional quality that made them visible and legible from a considerable distance, a quality that was particularly effective on the facades of temples and on the surfaces of colossal statues, where the inscriptions needed to be read from below and from afar. The visual impact of the deep carving was, in many ways, more appropriate to Ramesses's monumental ambitions than the delicate raised relief of his father. The bolder, more dramatic style suited the larger scale of Ramesses's buildings and conveyed the impression of power and permanence that the pharaoh intended. The deep carving was a form of insurance, a guarantee that Ramesses's name would survive on the monuments he claimed, whether he had built them or not, for as long as the stone itself endured. The combination of prolific building, systematic usurpation, and deep carving created a phenomenon that the 19th century Egyptologists recognized and that they found both impressive and troubling: the omnipresence of Ramesses. His name appeared on monuments that he had genuinely built: the temples at Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, the additions to Karnak and Luxor, the city of Ramesses, and on monuments that he had merely claimed, monuments that had been commissioned and constructed by pharaohs who had lived centuries before him and whose names he had erased and replaced with his own. His cartouches were carved boldly, deeply, and with the kind of permanence that only deep sunken relief could provide, on statues of Old Kingdom pharaohs, on obelisks of Middle Kingdom rulers, and on temples of 18th dynasty kings, a chronological range of appropriation that stretched across more than 1,000 years of Egyptian history, and that made the crucial scholarly distinction between Ramesses's genuine architectural creations and his appropriated and reinscribed claims virtually impossible to determine with confidence without detailed archaeological analysis. His name appeared on monuments that he had built and on monuments that he had merely claimed. His cartouches were carved on statues that were centuries older than he was. His face, or the idealized version of his face that his sculptors produced, stared out from temples and colossi across the entire length of the Nile Valley. The 19th century scholars who first catalogued the extent of Ramesses's usurpation were both impressed and appalled, impressed by the sheer audacity and the breathtaking scale of the campaign, appalled by the systematic dishonesty and the calculated deceptiveness it represented. The Egyptologist Jean-François Champollion, during his landmark expedition of 1828 to 1829, was among the first to recognize the pattern, noticing that many of the cartouches on Egyptian monuments showed evidence of recarving, with the original names of earlier pharaohs visible beneath the superimposed cartouches of Ramesses. Champollion's observation inaugurated a scholarly debate that continues to this day. To what extent should Ramesses be credited with building the monuments that bear his name, and to what extent was his architectural legacy a construction of appropriation rather than creation? The effect was overwhelming. It created the overwhelming and historically distorting impression of a pharaoh who had seemingly built everything, who had seemingly been everywhere, who had accomplished everything, and who had dominated the architectural landscape of Egypt to an extent that no other ruler had ever matched. The impression was not entirely false. Ramesses was a prolific builder, and many of his monuments were genuine creations. But the impression was also not entirely true. A significant portion of the monuments that bore his name had been built by others and appropriated by him. The building program of Ramesses II, the genuine building program, the structures that he actually commissioned and constructed rather than merely appropriated, is, even setting aside the usurpations, the most extensive, the most geographically comprehensive, the most institutionally transformative, and the most architecturally ambitious building program in the entire 3,000-year recorded history of the pharaonic state. A building program that, even after carefully accounting for the systematic usurpations that undoubtedly inflate the total, remains the single largest campaign of monumental construction that any individual in human history has ever undertaken. The program spanned the entire extraordinary length of the Nile Valley, from the marshy delta lowlands in the north to the granite cataracts of Nubia in the far south, and it produced some of the most iconic and most visually spectacular monuments in the entire history of human civilization. The twin temples of Abu Simbel, carved into the living rock of a sandstone cliff on the western bank of the Nile in Lower Nubia, approximately 290 kilometers south of the modern city of Aswan, are the most famous and the most visually dramatic of Ramesses' building projects. The Great Temple, dedicated to the gods Amun-Re, Re-Harakt, and Ptah, and to Ramesses himself as a deified ruler, features a facade dominated by 4 colossal seated figures of Ramesses, each one approximately 20 meters tall, roughly the height of a modern 6-story building, and each one weighing an estimated 1,200 tons of solid sandstone. The figures are carved from the living rock, their faces set in expressions of serene and eternal majesty, their bodies rigid in the formal posture of pharaonic authority, their scale designed to overwhelm the viewer with the sheer, overwhelming, almost physically oppressive, and almost intellectually incomprehensible magnitude of the Pharaoh's awesome divine power, the Pharaoh's claim to personal divinity, and the Pharaoh's absolute authority over every person and every territory that fell within the reach of his gaze. The Great Temple of Abu Simbel is not merely a facade, it is a complete temple, carved entirely from the solid rock of the cliff, extending deep into the sandstone and following the traditional Egyptian temple plan of progressively smaller and progressively darker chambers that lead the worshipper from the brilliant sunlight of the exterior to the absolute darkness of the innermost sanctuary. The transition from light to darkness is itself a theological statement, a recreation of the journey from the visible world of the living to the hidden world of the gods, from the temporal realm of human existence to the eternal realm of divine presence. The interior of the Great Temple extends approximately 55 meters into the cliff face, following a traditional temple plan of progressively smaller and darker chambers that lead from the sunlit entrance to the innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, where 4 seated figures, Amun-Re, Re-Harakt, Ptah, and the deified Ramesses himself, sit in the perpetual, the sacred, and the theologically significant darkness, awaiting the twice-yearly solar phenomenon that brings a shaft of sunlight through the entrance of the temple and illuminates 3 of the 4 statues. The engineering of Abu Simbel is, by any measure, one of the most impressive achievements of ancient architecture. The temple was carved from the living sandstone of the cliff face by teams of quarrymen and sculptors who worked from the top down, carving the colossal facade figures and then progressively excavating the interior chambers, removing thousands of tons of rock and shaping the excavated space into the precisely planned series of halls, columns, and chambers that the temple's theological program required. The precision of the carving is extraordinary. The 4 awe-inspiring colossal figures of the temple facade are essentially identical in scale, in proportions, and in the quality of their carving, despite having been carved by different teams of sculptors working at different heights on the cliff face. The engineering challenge of maintaining consistency across such enormous figures that are taller than a modern apartment building, was formidable, and the success of the achievement speaks to the extraordinary skill and the meticulous organization of the Egyptian artisans who executed it. The solar alignment was deliberate. The temple was oriented so that on the 22nd of February and the 22nd of October, the rising sun would penetrate the entire length of the temple and illuminate the carved stone faces of the 3 seated gods, bringing them momentarily to life with the warmth and the radiance of the living sun. The 4th figure, Ptah, the god of darkness and the creator god of Memphis, remains in shadow, a theological detail that demonstrates the precision and the intentionality of the temple's design. The story of Abu Simbel has a remarkable modern chapter that is itself one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements of the 20th century. In 1959, when the construction of the massive, politically controversial, and hydrologically transformative Aswan High Dam threatened to permanently and irreversibly flood the entire Nile Valley upstream of the dam site behind the new dam and to submerge the temples of Abu Simbel beneath the rising waters of Lake Nasser, UNESCO organized an unprecedented international rescue operation to save the temples. The operation, which lasted from 1964 to 1968 and involved engineers, archaeologists, and laborers from more than 50 countries, cut the temples from the cliff face in more than 1,000 carefully numbered blocks, each one weighing between 20 and 30 tons, and reassembled them on an artificial hill approximately 65 meters higher and 200 meters further from the river. The operation was one of the most complex and most technically challenging engineering projects of the 20th century, requiring the construction of a massive protective cofferdam to shield the temples from the steadily rising waters, the careful cutting of the temple facades and interiors into more than 1,000 individually numbered blocks, using handsaws rather than explosives to avoid damaging the ancient stone, the transportation of each block to a staging area, and the meticulous reassembly of the temples on the new site, ensuring that every block was returned to its original position and that the solar alignment of the Great Temple was preserved. The operation cost approximately $40 million, the equivalent of several $100 million in modern currency, and it saved one of the greatest architectural treasures of the ancient world from permanent destruction. The relocation of Abu Simbel is one of the most dramatic, the most technically impressive, and the most financially ambitious examples of the international commitment to the preservation and the protection of irreplaceable cultural heritage, and it is a fitting tribute to the man who built the temples, a man who understood, perhaps better than any other human being in history, the importance of ensuring that the monuments endure. The smaller temple at Abu Simbel, located approximately 100 meters north of the Great Temple, was dedicated to the goddess Hathor and to Ramesses' beloved first wife, Queen Nefertari. The facade of the smaller temple features 6 standing figures, each approximately 10 meters tall, 4 representing Ramesses and 2 representing Nefertari. The equal scale of the figures is significant. Nefertari is depicted at the same height as the pharaoh, a distinction that was extremely rare and virtually unprecedented in the entire history of Egyptian royal art, and that suggests the extraordinary, unprecedented, and deeply personal status that the queen held in Ramesses' court and in Ramesses' affections. The interior of the smaller temple is decorated with scenes of the queen making offerings to the gods and receiving their blessings, scenes that are remarkable for their artistic quality and for the tenderness with which the relationship between the pharaoh and the queen is depicted. Nefertari herself, Ramesses' great royal wife, the woman whom he called the one for whom the sun shines, is one of the most famous and most celebrated queens in the history of ancient Egypt. The relationship between Ramesses and Nefertari, as recorded in the inscriptions and the monuments that the pharaoh dedicated to his first wife, is one of the most compelling love stories in the history of the ancient world. The inscriptions describe Nefertari in terms that go beyond the conventional formulas of Egyptian royal discourse, terms that suggest genuine affection, genuine admiration, and genuine grief at her death. The phrase, "the one for whom the sun shines," the epithet by which Ramesses referred to Nefertari in the inscriptions at Abu Simbel, is not a standard royal formula, but a personal expression of devotion that stands out from the formal language of the pharaonic inscriptions. The dedication of the smaller temple at Abu Simbel to Nefertari, a temple in which the queen is depicted at the same scale as the pharaoh, a distinction that is virtually unprecedented in Egyptian art, is perhaps the most visible, the most architecturally monumental, and the most emotionally moving expression of the pharaoh's extraordinary, deeply and genuinely and movingly and publicly and monumentally personal, publicly and prominently and repeatedly declared an historically well-documented devotion to his beloved first wife. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens, QV66, discovered by the Italian Egyptologist Ernesto Schiaparelli in 1904, is widely regarded as the most beautifully decorated tomb in all of Egypt, its walls covered in vivid paintings of the Queen in the company of the gods, its colours so perfectly preserved that they seem to glow with an inner light. The discovery of the tomb by the Italian Egyptologist Ernesto Schiaparelli in 1904 was one of the most significant, most artistically stunning, and most emotionally overwhelming archaeological events of the early 20th century. A discovery that revealed, behind a sealed entrance that had protected the paintings from the worst effect, time, and exposure, a series of chambers whose walls were covered in the most vivid, the most delicately painted, and the most artistically accomplished wall paintings that the ancient Egyptian tradition had ever produced. The paintings show the Queen in the company of the gods, led by Isis, greeted by Hathor, judged by Osiris, guided through the underworld by the divine beings who would protect, guide, and ensure her safe and triumphant passage to the eternal afterlife. The colours are extraordinary: deep reds, brilliant blues, luminous golds, and pure whites that have been preserved with a fidelity that makes them look freshly painted rather than 3,000 years old. The draftsmanship is equally extraordinary. The figures are drawn with a confidence and a precision that reflects the work of the finest artisans in the Egyptian state, artisans who were clearly working at the peak of their ability, and who produced, in the tomb of Nefertari, the masterpiece of their careers. The tomb of Nefertari is, by scholarly consensus, the finest example of Egyptian wall painting that has survived, superior even to the reliefs of Seti I's KV-17 in the intensity of its colour and the delicacy of its draftsmanship. The temple at Abu Simbel was not the only monument that Ramesses dedicated to Nefertari. Throughout his reign, the pharaoh commissioned inscriptions and monuments that celebrated the queen's beauty, her wisdom, and her sacred status as the Lady of the Two Lands and the Mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt. The inscriptions use language that is unusually personal for Egyptian royal texts, language that suggests genuine affection rather than mere political convention, and that has led scholars to conclude that the relationship between Ramesses and Nefertari was one of the great love stories of the ancient world, a relationship that transcended the political and the dynastic, and that touched something genuinely personal and genuinely emotional in the heart of the most powerful man in the ancient world. Nefertari died relatively early in Ramesses' reign, probably around his 24th year, and her death was, by all evidence, a genuine personal loss for the pharaoh, who commemorated her memory in inscriptions and monuments for the rest of his extraordinarily long life. The Ramesseum, Ramesses' mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, is another of the great monuments of his reign, though it survives today in a more ruined state than the temples at Abu Simbel. The temple was built on an enormous scale, covering an area of approximately 10 hectares, and included a massive hypostyle hall, extensive storage magazines of mud brick, a temple school for scribes, and a series of colossal statues of the pharaoh, the largest of which, a seated figure carved from a single block of granite, was one of the most massive stone statues ever created in the ancient world. The Ramesseum was designed as a comprehensive funerary complex, not merely a temple for the worship of the dead pharaoh, but an entire institutional campus that included administrative offices, storage facilities, a scribal school, and the economic infrastructure needed to maintain the temple's ritual activities in perpetuity. The mud brick storage magazines that surrounded the temple's stone core have been excavated and studied by archaeologists, revealing a complex system of vaulted storerooms that held the grain, the oil, the wine, and the other commodities that the temple's priests and workers required. The scale of the storage facilities suggests that the Ramesseum was one of the largest economic institutions in the Theban area, a major employer, a major consumer of agricultural produce, and a major contributor to the local economy. The Ramesseum Colossus, now fallen and shattered, its fragments scattered in the dramatic posture of ruin across the temple floor, weighing, by modern estimates, approximately 1,000 tons and standing, when intact, approximately 17 meters tall, making it one of the largest stone statues ever carved from a single block in the ancient world. The granite from which the Colossus was carved had been quarried at Aswan, more than 200 kilometers upriver, and transported by barge on the Nile to the Ramesseum site, a logistical feat of extraordinary complexity and scale. The fallen Ramesseum Colossus is the statue that inspired the English poet Shelley's famous sonnet Ozymandias, with its haunting, melancholy, and profoundly insightful meditation on the impermanence of power, the vanity of human ambition, and the ironic fate of a builder whose works, designed to endure forever, designed to proclaim his greatness to all the ages, designed to be the visible and permanent proof of his divine power, have been reduced, by the very time they were built to defeat, to fragments and ruins in a featureless desert. The poem captures, in 14 lines of English verse, the essential paradox of Ramesses's legacy. The man who built more than any other human being in history is also the man whose magnificent but ruined monuments best and most poignantly illustrate the ultimate futility of building, the impermanence of power, and the ultimate victory of time over even the most determined and the most prolific human ambition. The poem's speaker encounters a ruined colossus in the desert, its pedestal bearing the inscription, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." But the works have crumbled to nothing, and the surrounding desert is lone and level in every direction. The poem is a meditation on the irony of Ramesses's legacy, the greatest, the most prolific, and the most monumentally ambitious builder in all of human history, whose magnificent, seemingly indestructible, and apparently eternal monuments have been inexorably and mercilessly reduced by the relentless and impartial passage of time to fragments, ruins, and the eloquent silence of the desert. The capital city of Ramesses, the House of Ramesses, was one of the most ambitious and most consequential of Ramesses's building projects. Located in the eastern Nile Delta, near the modern village of Qantir, Ramesses was constructed as a new capital city that would serve as the administrative, military, and diplomatic center of the Egyptian state. The city was deliberately and strategically positioned close to the Levantine frontier, where the Egyptian military establishment needed to maintain garrisons and to project power against the Hittites, the Levantine city-states, and other regional rivals, and close to the Mediterranean coast, where the navy needed to protect Egyptian maritime trade. The fate of Ramesses is itself a cautionary tale about the impermanence of human achievement and the vulnerability of even the greatest cities to the forces of nature. The city of Ramesses, which flourished for approximately 2 centuries as one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the ancient world, but which was eventually abandoned after the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, the eastern distributary on which the city's harbour, its water supply, and its agricultural hinterland all critically depended, shifted its course eastward, leaving the once great and once thriving city without the essential freshwater supply on which its busy harbour, its productive agricultural hinterland, and its enormous population all critically depended, rendering the city's once busy harbour inaccessible and its agricultural infrastructure unsustainable, is one of the most important, most historically significant, and most technically challenging archaeological sites in the entire Nile Delta region. The delta's high water table and the intensive agricultural use of the land have made excavation extremely difficult, and much of what is known about the city comes from ancient textual descriptions, from the objects that were moved from Ramesses to the later capital of Tanis when the city was abandoned, and from the limited but revealing archaeological work that has been conducted at the site of Qantir since the 1920s. The German archaeologist Edgar Pusch and his team have conducted systematic excavations at Qantir since the 1980s, uncovering evidence of a city that was, at its peak, one of the largest, the most sophisticated, and the most impressively equipped urban centers in the entire ancient world. A city whose population may have exceeded 300,000 people and whose total area covered an impressive approximately 30 square kilometers of intensively developed urban landscape. Excavations at Kantir have revealed the remains of a vast urban complex, workshops for the large-scale, industrially organized production of military chariots and bronze weapons, the principal and indispensable military hardware of the formidable Egyptian war machine, including substantial evidence of sophisticated bronze casting facilities and metalworking workshops that could produce hundreds of weapons and chariot fittings, stables and paddocks that could accommodate large numbers of horses, and that included veterinary facilities for the care of injured or sick animals, administrative buildings that housed the scribes and the officials who managed the city's enormous bureaucracy, stables that could accommodate hundreds of horses, administrative buildings, temples, palaces, and residential quarters for the city's enormous population. Ancient texts describe Ramesses as one of the most beautiful and most prosperous cities in the ancient world, a city of gardens, orchards, and fish-filled lakes, a city where the granaries were full, and the markets were rich, and the streets were alive with the bustle of a great imperial capital. The scope of Ramesses's building program extended far beyond the major sites that modern tourists visit. In Nubia alone, the resource-rich territory to the south of Egypt that provided the Egyptian state with gold, ivory, ebony, and other luxury goods, Ramesses built or expanded at least 7 temples, including the 2 great temples at Abu Simbel and smaller temples at Beit El Wali, Gef Hussein, Wadi Es Sibua, Der, and Aksha. Each temple served a dual purpose: as a religious institution dedicated to the worship of the gods, and as a political statement, a visible, monumental, and architecturally overwhelming demonstration of Egyptian sovereignty and divine authority over the Nubian territory, and a permanent, monumental, and psychologically overwhelming reminder to the conquered Nubian population that the pharaoh's authority was absolute, his power was divine, and his power was divine. The Nubian temples were not merely religious buildings, they were instruments of imperial control, architectural embodiments of the Egyptian state's ancient, sacred, and politically non-negotiable claim to dominion over the lands and the peoples to the south. At Karnak, Ramesses completed the great hypostyle hall that his father Seti had begun, adding the southern half of the hall with its decorative program of deeply carved reliefs depicting the pharaoh's military campaigns and religious rituals. The hypostyle hall, 134 columns covering 5,000 square meters, remains one of the most impressive architectural spaces in the history of human civilization, and Ramesses's contribution to it, though artistically less refined than his father's northern half, is no less architecturally impressive. At Luxor, the southern sanctuary of Amun, connected to Karnak by the great processional avenue of sphinxes, along which the god Amun travelled during the annual Opet festival, Ramesses added a massive pylon, a colonnaded courtyard surrounded by colossal statues of the pharaoh, and a pair of red granite obelisks that flanked the entrance to the temple. The pylon, the monumental gateway that served as the facade of the temple, was decorated with scenes of the Battle of Kadesh, ensuring that every visitor to the temple would be confronted with the pharaoh's own characteristically self-aggrandizing version of his greatest and most celebrated military engagement. The colossal statues that stood before the pylon, seated figures of the pharaoh, each one carved from single, massive blocks of red Aswan granite, were among the most visually impressive examples of monumental sculpture in the Nile Valley. The obelisks, tall, tapering stone pillars, topped with pyramidal caps that caught the first rays of the rising sun, and that served as symbols of the sun god's creative power, stood at the entrance to the temple, their surfaces covered in hieroglyphic inscriptions celebrating the pharaoh's achievements. The Luxor additions are significant not merely for their architectural quality, but for the way they demonstrate Ramesses's characteristic approach to building, an approach that combined genuine new construction with the appropriation and the reinterpretation of existing structures. The pylon and the courtyard were new constructions, built to Ramesses's specifications, decorated with his inscriptions, and integrated into the existing temple in a way that extended and enriched the original design. But the colossal statues that stood before the pylon included at least some figures that had been usurped from earlier pharaohs, their original cartouches erased and replaced with Ramesses' name, their original identities permanently and irretrievably subsumed into the omnipresent, all-consuming image of the Ramesside pharaoh. One of the obelisks was removed from Luxor in 1831 by the French engineer Jean-Baptiste Apollinaire Lebas, transported by ship to France, and erected in the Place de la Concorde in Paris, where it stands today. A fragment of Ramesses' building program transplanted to the capital of a civilization that the pharaoh could never have imagined. At Luxor, Ramesses added a massive pylon and a courtyard to the existing temple, fronted by colossal statues and a pair of obelisks, one of which was removed in 1831 and now stands in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. At Abydos, he completed the temple that his father had begun and added his own temple nearby. At Memphis, he erected colossal statues that awed visitors for millennia. The building program was, in its totality, the most extensive, the most ambitious, and the most architecturally transformative campaign of monumental construction ever undertaken by a single individual in the history of the ancient world. And now we arrive at the question that the colossal statues and the deep-carved cartouches and the usurped monuments and the Kadesh propaganda and the peace treaty and the 100 children and the 66-year reign all converge upon. The question that makes the story of Ramesses II not merely a chapter in the history of ancient Egypt, but a meditation on the nature of greatness, the relationship between achievement and self-promotion, and the terrible irony of a man who spent his entire life trying to be remembered and who succeeded beyond his wildest imagination, only to be remembered, in the end, as the very embodiment of the impermanence that he spent his life trying to defeat. Who was Ramesses the Great, really? And what does his legacy tell us about the nature of human ambition and the human desire to outlast death? The conventional portrait of Ramesses, the portrait that appears in most popular histories and most tourist guides, is the portrait of the greatest pharaoh of ancient Egypt, the supreme ruler, the ultimate builder, the warrior king who defeated the Hittites and signed the first peace treaty and built Abu's symbol and fathered 100 children and lived to be 90. The portrait is not wrong. Every element of it is based on historical evidence, and the scale of Ramesses' achievements is genuinely extraordinary. But the portrait is also incomplete because it presents Ramesses' self-image as historical fact, his propaganda as documentary record, his version of events as the authoritative account. The portrait is, in many ways, exactly what Ramesses wanted posterity to believe. And the question is whether posterity should accept it uncritically or whether it should look behind the colossi and the cartouches and ask what the evidence actually shows. The question of Ramesses' greatness, the question of whether the conventional assessment of him as the greatest pharaoh of ancient Egypt is justified by the evidence or merely by the self-promotion, is one of the most debated questions in modern Egyptology. Some scholars have argued that Ramesses deserves the title the Great because his achievements, even accounting for the usurpations and the propaganda, are genuinely extraordinary. The peace treaty alone, the oldest known, the most comprehensively preserved, and the most diplomatically sophisticated peace treaty in all of recorded history, would be more than sufficient to earn him a permanent and honoured place among the most important rulers of the ancient world. And the building program, even after discounting the usurped monuments and the appropriated statues, is still the most extensive, the most geographically widespread, and the most architecturally ambitious in the entire history of the Egyptian state. Other scholars have argued that the title is undeserved, that Ramesses was a competent but not brilliant military commander, that his greatest military engagement was a stalemate that he presented as a victory, that a significant portion of his architectural legacy was appropriated rather than created, and that his reputation is, to a significant extent, the product of his own propaganda rather than of genuine achievement. The truth, as is often the case in historical debates, lies somewhere between the two positions, and the complexity of the truth is itself one of the most interesting and most instructive aspects of Ramesses' story. The evidence shows a man of extraordinary energy, extraordinary ambition, and extraordinary political intelligence, but also a man of extraordinary vanity, extraordinary self-promotion, and an extraordinary willingness to distort the historical record in the service of his own reputation. The Battle of Kadesh was a stalemate that Ramesses presented as a triumph. The usurpation of his predecessor's monuments was a form of architectural and historical theft that Ramesses successfully and shamelessly presented as a legitimate form of building. The peace treaty with the Hittites, the greatest and most historically enduring diplomatic achievement of his entire long reign, was concluded not from a position of overwhelming strength, but from a position of strategic necessity and diplomatic pragmatism, after 16 years of inconclusive warfare had demonstrated that neither side could achieve a decisive military victory. Something is wrong with our assumptions about what makes a pharaoh great, and the story of Ramesses II is the evidence. We assume that greatness is measured by scale, by the number of monuments erected, the height of the colossi carved, the length of the reign endured, the number of children fathered, and the geographic extent of the territory controlled. By these measures, Ramesses is unquestionably the greatest pharaoh in the entire 3,000-year history of the Egyptian state. The pharaoh who built the most, who reigned the longest, who fathered the most children, and who left the largest physical imprint on the landscape of the Nile Valley. But if greatness is measured by quality, by the artistic refinement of the monuments, the strategic brilliance of the campaigns, the originality of the achievements, the depth of the theological vision, then the picture is considerably more complex and considerably more nuanced. The reliefs of Ramesses are less artistically refined than the reliefs of his father Seti. A judgment that is not merely subjective, but that is supported by detailed technical analysis of the carving techniques, the proportional systems, and the modelling of the figures in the two pharaohs' respective monuments. Seti's reliefs are characterized by a delicacy of line, a subtlety of modelling, and a sensitivity of surface to treatment that reflect the highest achievements of the Egyptian relief tradition. Ramesses's reliefs are characterized by a bolder, more deeply cut, and more schematic style that sacrifices the delicacy of Seti's work for the clarity and the impact that Ramesses's larger-scale monuments required. The difference is not merely a matter of personal taste. It reflects the different priorities of the two pharaohs. Seti prioritized quality, creating fewer but more refined monuments. Ramesses prioritized quantity, creating more monuments, but accepting a lower level of artistic refinement in order to achieve the scale and the ubiquity that his vision of pharaonic greatness demanded. The Battle of Kadesh was less decisive than the military campaigns of Thutmose III. The building program, for all its scale, included a significant component of usurpation that complicates any simple assessment of Ramesses as a builder. The paradox is not merely academic, it raises fundamental questions about the nature of historical memory, about the complex and fraught relationship between the past and the present, and about the criteria by which we judge, evaluate, and rank the achievements of historical figures and the civilizations they led. If we judge Ramesses by his own standards, by the standards of the Egyptian pharaonic tradition, in which the appropriation of predecessors' monuments was an accepted practice, and in which the pharaoh's carefully constructed self-presentation as an invincible divine warrior was a theological necessity and a political obligation rather than a personal vanity, then his legacy is genuinely extraordinary, a supreme expression of the pharaonic ideal of the divine ruler who embodies the power and the magnificence of the state he governs. If we judge him by modern standards, by the standards of historical accuracy, intellectual honesty, and respect for the achievements of others, then his legacy is more problematic, a complex, fascinating, and historically instructive mixture of genuine achievement and systematic misrepresentation that makes it difficult to assess his actual contribution to the architectural and cultural heritage of ancient Egypt. Let that sink in. The greatest builder in Egyptian history was also the greatest usurper. The man who erected more monuments than any other pharaoh was also the man who appropriated more monuments than any other pharaoh. The colossi that stare out from the temples and the cliffs and the museum galleries of the modern world are genuine achievements, but they are achievements that coexist with a systematic campaign of appropriation that makes it impossible, in many cases, to determine which monuments Ramesses actually built and which he merely claimed. The practice also raises deeper philosophical questions. Questions about the nature of authorship, about the complex and historically important relationship between the commissioner who orders a monument and the anonymous creator who actually builds it, about whether a monument belongs to the pharaoh who ordered it built or to the artisans who actually carved it, and about whether the act of claiming a monument through the inscription of a name is fundamentally different from the act of creating it through the labor of building. These questions have no easy answers, and the difficulty of answering them is itself a reflection of the complexity of Ramesses's legacy and the challenge that it poses to any simplistic, uncritical narrative of pharaonic achievement and historical greatness. The legacy is real. The temples at Abu Simbel are real. The historically momentous peace treaty with the Hittites is real. The architecturally magnificent hypostyle hall at Karnak is real, and the sheer volume, the geographic scope, and the architectural ambition of the genuine building activity that Ramesses personally commissioned and undertook during his unprecedented 66-year reign is, by any standard, extraordinary. But the legacy is also, to a significant and historically consequential degree, a construction, a narrative built from a combination of genuine achievement, systematic appropriation, and sophisticated propaganda that makes it impossible to separate the historical reality from the pharaoh's self-presentation with anything approaching precision, a narrative built from a combination of genuine achievement and systematic self-promotion that makes Ramesses II not merely the greatest builder in Egyptian history, but also the greatest propagandist. The question that Ramesses' legacy poses, the question of whether greatness is measured by scale or by quality, by the number of monuments or by the artistic refinement of the monuments, by the volume of the achievement or by the originality and the authenticity of the achievement, is a question that resonates far beyond the confines of Egyptology. It is a question about the fundamental nature of greatness itself, a question about whether the greatest achievements of the human species are the ones that are measured by their quantity and their visibility, or the ones that are measured by their quality and their depth. About whether the greatest human achievements are the ones that are the largest and the most visible and the most frequently repeated, or the ones that are the most refined and the most original and the most deeply conceived. The contrast between Ramesses and his father Seti, between the son who built the most and the father who built the best, is a contrast that recurs throughout the history of human civilization, a contrast between quantity and quality, between ambition and artistry, between the desire to be everywhere and the desire to be perfect. This is not science fiction. This is the reality of Ramesses' legacy, a legacy that is simultaneously magnificent and misleading, simultaneously genuine and constructed, simultaneously one of the greatest achievements in the history of human civilization, and one of the most sophisticated exercises in self-promotion that the ancient world ever produced. The colossi at Abu Simbel are real. The hypostyle hall at Karnak is real. The peace treaty with the Hittites is real. But the narrative that frames these achievements, the narrative of the warrior king who single-handedly defeated the Hittites at Kadesh, who built everything that bears his name, who was chosen by the gods and favored by fortune and destined for eternal glory. The narrative is, at least in part, a creation of Ramesses' own extraordinarily sophisticated and comprehensively effective propaganda machine, a machine that employed scribes, sculptors, painters, and architects to produce a version of history that served the pharaoh's interests, and that was disseminated across the entire Egyptian state through the medium of monumental architecture. The propaganda machine that Ramesses deployed was not merely effective, it was revolutionary, introducing techniques of mass communication and narrative control that would not be seen again until the modern era. The Kadesh inscriptions alone reproduced on the walls of at least 5 major temples, represent one of the most extensive propaganda campaigns in the history of the ancient world, a campaign that succeeded in transforming a military stalemate into a narrative of divine triumph, and that maintained that transformation for more than 3,000 years. The success of Ramesses's propaganda campaign, a campaign that has shaped the perception of his reign for more than 3,000 years, that has influenced the judgments of scholars and historians, and that has created a popular image of Ramesses that is at least partially at odds with the historical evidence, raises a question that is profoundly relevant to the modern world, a question about the fraught and historically consequential relationship between political power and historical truth, between the official state-sanctioned narrative and the memes, more ambiguous historical reality, between the version of events that the powerful promote and the version of events that the evidence supports. Ramesses had the power to control the narrative, to commission the inscriptions, to approve the texts, to determine which version of events would be carved into stone and preserved for eternity. And the narrative he chose to promote, the narrative of the divine warrior who single-handedly defeated the Hittite army at Kadesh, who built every monument that bears his name, who was chosen by the gods and destined for eternal glory, was not, strictly speaking, the complete, the unvarnished, and the historically accurate truth. It was a version of the truth, a version that strategically emphasized the elements that served the pharaoh's political and theological interests, and that minimized or omitted the elements that did not. It was a version that was designed to endure, carved in stone, inscribed on temple walls, disseminated across the entire Egyptian state, and it has endured for more than 32 centuries, shaping the perception of Ramesses's reign and influencing the judgments of scholars and historians who sometimes failed to distinguish between the pharaoh's self-presentation and the historical reality that the self-presentation was designed to obscure. It was a version of the truth, a selective interpretation of the truth, a rhetorically enhanced and theologically framed interpretation of the truth, a selectively edited and theologically enhanced version of events that served the pharaoh's interests and that bore only a partial resemblance to what actually happened on the banks of the Orontes River in 1274 BC, a carefully constructed, theologically framed, and artistically elaborated version of events that was specifically designed to serve the pharaoh's political interests and to enhance his theological standing, and that has been remarkably successful in shaping the perception of his reign for more than 3,000 years. We have followed Ramesses from his birth as the second son of Seti I to his death at approximately the age of 90, from the young, ambitious, and physically vigorous prince who accompanied his father on actual military campaigns to the ancient king who outlived his wives, his children, and the first 12 of his designated heirs. We have seen the military career, the Sheridan pirates, the Amuru campaign, the near disaster at Kadesh, the 16 years of inconclusive warfare, the peace treaty. We have seen the building program, Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, P. Ramesses, Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, and the hundreds of other monuments, statues, obelisks, and colossi that bear his name. We have seen the usurpation, the systematic appropriation of his predecessors' monuments, the deep carving that ensured his name would survive, the complex and historically problematic combination of genuine building and systematic claiming that makes his architectural legacy both genuine and constructed. What does this story mean? Not for the history of ancient Egypt, but for the human beings who hear it more than 32 centuries after the last stonemason put down his chisel. It means that the desire to be remembered, to leave a permanent mark on the world, to ensure that one's name and one's achievements outlast the brief span of a single human life, is one of the most powerful forces in human history, a force that has driven the construction of the greatest monuments, the composition of the greatest literature, and the prosecution of the most ambitious political and military campaigns that the human species has ever undertaken. Ramesses felt this desire with an intensity that bordered on obsession, an intensity that manifested itself in the sheer staggering and almost intellectually incomprehensible quantity, the sheer relentless and all-pervading ubiquity, and the sheer breathtaking geographic reach of the monuments he built, the cartouches he carved, the images he commissioned, and the inscriptions he dictated. He carved his name so deeply and so frequently and on so many surfaces that 3 millennia of erosion, conquest, and neglect have not been able to erase it. The desire to be remembered was not irrational. It was, in the context of the Egyptian theological system, the most rational and the most urgently practical desire that a human being could possess. In the Egyptian theological understanding of death, the afterlife, and the conditions for eternal survival, to be remembered was to survive. To have one's name spoken was literally and theologically to continue to exist in the afterlife, and to be forgotten, to have one's name cease to be spoken, to have one's monuments crumble, to have one's identity dissolve into the anonymity of the unremembered dead, was to die the second death, the true death, the permanent death, the true death, the death from which there was no return. Ramesses's building program was not merely an exercise in vanity. It was, in the deepest theological sense, a program of survival, an effort to ensure that his name would be spoken and his memory preserved for as long as the stone endured and the civilization that created it continued to exist. The desire to be remembered, the deep, urgent, almost desperate desire to ensure that one's name survives the death of one's body and the collapse of one's civilization, is not unique to Ramesses. It is universal. It is the desire that drives the writing of books, the composition of symphonies, the painting of masterpieces, the painting of pictures, the construction of buildings and monuments, and the accumulation of achievements and accomplishments that the achiever hopes will endure beyond the span of a single human life. Ramesses felt this desire with an intensity that was extraordinary even by pharaonic standards. But the desire itself was not extraordinary. It was human. It was the same desire, the same deep, urgent, fundamentally human desire to leave a mark, to make a difference, to create something that will outlast the brief span of a single life, that drives every person who has ever written a name on a wall, carved initials into a tree, built a house, planted a garden, written a book, composed a song, or told a story to a child in the hope that the story would be passed on, and the memory would endure, and the name would survive, planted a tree in a garden, or told a story to a child in the hope that the story would be passed on. The irony is that Ramesses succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. His name has survived for more than 3,200 years. His face is recognized by millions of people who have never studied Egyptology and who could not name a single other pharaoh. His monuments dominate the archaeological landscape of Egypt, dominate it so thoroughly that it is impossible to visit any major Egyptian temple or museum without encountering his face, his name, his cartouche, or his image. The colossi at Abu Simbel are among the most photographed monuments in the world. The fallen colossus at the Ramesseum is one of the most famous, the most frequently visited and photographed, the most poetically evocative, the most literally and artistically inspiring, and the most literarily celebrated ruins in all of global archaeology. The obelisk in the Place de la Concorde is one of the most recognizable landmarks in Paris. The peace treaty with the Hittites hangs in the United Nations as a symbol of the antiquity of the human aspiration to resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than through force. His mummy lies in a museum in Cairo, its face still recognizable, its features still individual, its presence still commanding, still projecting an authority and a gravitas that survives the dissolution of the flesh and the collapse of the civilization that gave it meaning. The mummy of Ramesses II is not merely a relic, it is a presence, a physical embodiment of one of the most extraordinary and most consequential human lives ever lived, a tangible connection to a man whose extraordinary, driven, and historically unmatched personal ambitions were so vast, so all-encompassing, so comprehensive, so geographically far-reaching, so relentlessly, and so obsessively pursued over the entire course of nearly a full century of active, eventful, and historically consequential life, whose achievements were so extensive, and whose desire to be remembered was so intense that 3,200 years of history of conquest, of cultural transformation, and of civilizational change have not been sufficient to dim the force of his remarkable personality or to diminish the scale of his legacy. Ramesses wanted to be remembered, and he is remembered. He wanted to be eternal, and he is, as far as any human being can be, eternal. The stone has endured, the name has survived. The face is still there, in the museum, staring at the visitors who file past it every day. 32 centuries after the man who wore that face drew his last breath in the palace at Ramesses and was carried in solemn procession to his tomb in the Valley of the Kings. But the irony has another dimension, a dimension that Shelley captured in Ozymandias, and that every visitor to the magnificent but profoundly melancholy and hauntingly evocative ruins of Ramesseum has instinctively felt. The monuments have survived, but the civilization that created them has not. The trajectory of Egyptian civilization after Ramesses' death was one of slow, protracted, and ultimately irreversible decline, a decline that saw the loss of the empire, the fragmentation of the state, the erosion of pharaonic authority, and the eventual and irreversible conquest of Egypt by a succession of foreign powers, each one more culturally distant from the pharaonic tradition than the last. Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, who dismantled the pharaonic system and replaced it with their own forms of governance. The decline was not immediate. The 20th dynasty produced at least one genuinely capable pharaoh, Ramesses III, who was capable of defending Egypt against major external threats. But the long-term trajectory was unmistakable, and the civilization that Ramesses had ruled at the peak of its power and its cultural confidence would, within a few centuries of his death, become a shadow of its former self, its monuments standing as increasingly anachronistic relics of a greatness that the living population could no longer replicate and could barely comprehend. The colossi stand, but the people who built them, the people who worshipped at their feet, the people who believed in the gods and the pharaoh and the eternal order of Ma'at, the people who made the civilization that made the monuments possible, those people are gone. The monuments are beautiful. This is the undeniable and irreducible truth that survives all the scholarly debate about usurpation and propaganda, and the historical accuracy of the Kadesh. Inscriptions. The colossi at Abu Simbel are beautiful. The hypostyle hall at Karnak is beautiful. The tomb of Nefertari is beautiful. The alabaster sarcophagus that held Ramesses' body is beautiful. The beauty is real, it is present, it is accessible to anyone who stands before these monuments and allows them to speak across the centuries. But the monuments are also lonely. Relics of a world that no longer exists, fragments of a civilization that flourished for 3,000 years and then died more than 2 millennia ago, monuments that were built to serve a theological system that no living person practices and to celebrate the achievements of a ruler whose kingdom has been dust for more than 100 generations. The loneliness of the monuments is the most poignant aspect of Ramesses' legacy, more poignant than the propaganda, more poignant than the usurpation, more poignant than the military stalemate that was presented as a triumph. The colossi at Abu Simbel were carved to be objects of worship, to inspire awe in the hearts of the people who passed before them, to remind the Nubian population of the pharaoh's power, to serve as the visible embodiment of the divine authority that the pharaoh claimed. Today, they are objects of tourism, admired for their aesthetic beauty and their engineering achievement, but divorced from the theological context that gave them meaning and the civilization that gave them purpose, standing in the desert sun like the tombstones of a cemetery whose mourners have all departed. The story of Ramesses is also a story about the relationship between a pharaoh and his people, between the ruler who built the monuments and the workers who constructed them. The village of Deir el-Medina, the community of artisans who built the royal tombs, provides an extraordinary window into the lives of the people who served Ramesses, and the picture is not entirely flattering to the pharaoh. During Ramesses' reign, the workers at Deir el-Medina staged what may be the first recorded labor strike in human history, downing their tools and refusing to work because their wages, paid in grain and other goods, had not been delivered on time. Strike is recorded in the remarkable Turin strike papyrus, one of the most historically significant, the most socially revealing, and the most institutionally important labor documents from the entire ancient world, which describes the workers' specific complaints, the authorities' response, and the negotiations that followed. The strike occurred during the 29th year of Ramesses's reign, a year in which the grain deliveries that constituted the workers' wages had been delayed, apparently due to administrative failures in the distribution system. The workers, the specialized craftsmen and laborers of Deir el-Medina, the men who carved and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings and who built the mortuary temples on the west bank of Thebes, marched from their village to the vicinity of the mortuary, temples of Thutmose III and Ramesses II, and sat down, refusing to work. The protest was organized, disciplined, and remarkably effective. The workers did not riot, did not resort to violence or to the destruction of property, did not damage the temples or the tombs, but simply refused to perform the labor that the state had hired them to perform until the wages that the state had promised them were delivered. The authorities, the local administrators who were responsible for the management of the Theban necropolis and for the distribution of wages to the workforce, responded by negotiating with the workers, acknowledging the legitimacy of their grievance, and arranging for the delivery of the overdue grain rations. The workers marched from their village to the vicinity of the mortuary temples and sat down, refusing to return to work until their grievances were addressed. The protest was remarkable not only for its organization and its effectiveness, the wages were eventually delivered, but for the fact that it was recorded at all, a rare, invaluable, and historically extraordinary glimpse into the lived experience of the ordinary people. The craftsmen, the laborers, the scribes, the foremen, and the supply officials, whose labor and whose organizational capacity made the pharaoh's monumental ambitions materially possible. The Deir el-Medina records, the ostraca, the papyri, the attendance registers, and the administrative correspondence that have been recovered from the village sites provide the most detailed picture of working-class life in the ancient world that any archaeological site has ever produced. And the picture they present is one of a community that was proud, skilled, socially cohesive, and willing to assert its rights when those rights were violated by the failure of the state to fulfill its obligations, whose labor made the pharaoh's monumental ambitions possible. The strike is a reminder that the history of Ramesses's reign is not merely the history of the pharaoh and his monuments, but the history of the thousands of ordinary men and women whose labor, whose skill, and whose endurance made the monuments possible, and whose individual names, unlike the immortalized name of the pharaoh they served, have been almost entirely and irretrievably lost to the silence of history. The strike is a reminder that the monumental achievements of Ramesses's reign, the temples, the colossi, the obelisks, were not built by the pharaoh's mythological divine power, but by the labor, the skill, the endurance, and the organizational discipline of ordinary, anonymous human beings who worked in physically demanding and often dangerous conditions, and who expected to be paid for their efforts. It is late. The sun has set over the distant western hills. The Valley of the Kings is dark. KV7, the tomb of Ramesses II, one of the largest and most ambitious tombs ever constructed in the valley, a tomb whose original decorative program was among the most extensive of any royal burial in the Theban necropolis, sits in the low ground near the center of the valley floor, its entrance visible but its interior closed to visitors. The tomb, KV7, located in the low ground of the central valley, where rainwater naturally collects during the rare but devastating flash floods that periodically sweep through the Theban hills, has been badly damaged by centuries of repeated flooding. The floods filled the tomb's corridors and chambers with debris, deposited layers of mud and silt on the decorated surfaces, and caused the salt-laden moisture to penetrate the limestone walls, creating a process of chemical deterioration that has progressively destroyed the painted reliefs. The irony is severe. The tomb of the greatest builder in Egyptian history, the tomb that should have been the most magnificent and the most enduringly decorated burial in the entire Valley of the Kings, has suffered more damage than almost any other tomb in the valley, not because it was poorly built or poorly located, but because the geological and hydrological conditions of its specific location made it uniquely vulnerable to the flooding that the tomb's designers could not have predicted and that no ancient engineering technique could have prevented. The tomb has been badly damaged by centuries of flash flooding, the same floods that filled the corridors of many tombs in the valley, and its decoration, once magnificent, has been severely degraded by the water and the debris that periodically swept through its chambers. The tomb that was built for the greatest builder in Egyptian history is, paradoxically, one of the most damaged and most poorly preserved tombs in the entire valley. So here is the answer, the best and most honest answer we can give to the question we began with. Who was Ramesses II, and what does his story tell us? He was a commoner's grandson who became a god. He was born into a dynasty that was only a single generation old, and he transformed it into the most powerful, the most architecturally prolific, the most diplomatically active, and the most culturally productive dynasty in the entire recorded history of the Egyptian state. He fought the largest chariot battle in recorded history, presented a stalemate as a triumph, and then, with the strategic intelligence that was his greatest gift, negotiated a peace treaty that ended decades of warfare, and that stands, 32 centuries later, as a symbol of the human capacity to resolve conflicts through diplomacy, rather than through force. He was the greatest builder in human history, a man whose building program, even discounting the usurpations, was the most extensive and the most architecturally ambitious that any individual has ever undertaken. And he was also the greatest usurper, a man who systematically appropriated the monuments of his predecessors, who carved his name over the names of pharaohs who had lived centuries before him, and who created a version of the architectural landscape of Egypt in which his own name appeared on virtually every major monument, whether he had built it or not. He erected more monuments than any other pharaoh and appropriated more monuments than any other pharaoh. He carved his name so deeply into the stone of Egypt that 32 centuries of erosion have not been able to erase it. He fathered more than 100 children and outlived most of them. He married at least 8 wives and buried most of them. He ruled for 66 years, 2/3 of a century, a span of time so vast that by the end of his reign, nearly all of his subjects had been born during it, and could not remember a time when anyone else had sat on the throne. The numbers, when assembled together, are striking and almost overwhelming in their cumulative impact. 66 years on the throne, at least 100 children, at least 15 military campaigns, at least 8 official wives, temples at Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, Memphis, and Abu Simbel, a new capital city in the Delta, the first known peace treaty in recorded history, a mummy that still shows the face of the man who wore it, 32 centuries after his death. The final decades of Ramesses's reign were marked by a slow, inexorable decline, not in the pharaoh's political authority, which remained absolute until the end, but in his physical capacity and in the vitality of the Egyptian state. The military campaigns had ceased, the building program had slowed. The pharaoh was increasingly confined to his palace at Pi-Ramesses, his body weakened and progressively debilitated by the accumulated physical toll of 9 extraordinary decades of life, his court dominated by the aging officials and the surviving princes who had served him for decades. The succession was uncertain. Ramesses had formally and publicly designated heir after heir, only to watch each one sicken and die before him, the pitiless and unpredictable biological lottery of the ancient world claiming his sons one by one over the course of 6 decades. He died at approximately 90 years of age, ancient, arthritic, teeth worn to the roots, his body weakened by the accumulated injuries and diseases of 9 decades of life. He had outlived the beautiful, beloved, and deeply mourned Nefertari, his cherished and celebrated first wife. He had outlived Isetnefret, his second wife. He had outlived the first 12 of his designated heirs, princes, who had been groomed for the throne, who had been trained in the arts of warfare and governance, who had been given titles and responsibilities and expectations, and who had died one after another of disease, of injury, of the simple biological attrition that no amount of royal privilege could prevent, before their father, before the ancient, physically failing, increasingly arthritic, visibly aging, an increasingly isolated but politically indomitable king who sat on the throne year after year, decade after decade, outliving his children with the terrible persistence of a man whose body refused to yield to the time that was consuming everything around him, one after another, decade after decade, until the 13th son, Meneptah, an elderly man himself by the time of his accession, a man who had spent decades waiting for a throne that seemed perpetually occupied, a man whose father's extraordinary longevity had turned the normal Egyptian succession into an exercise in patience and attrition, finally inherited the kingdom that Ramesses had spent 66 years building. Let that sink in. The personal cost of Ramesses's extraordinary longevity, the cost that the 66-year reign exacted from the man who endured it, is one of the most humanly affecting aspects of the story. Ramesses lived to see his kingdom at peace, his borders secure, his monuments rising across the length and breadth of the Nile Valley. But he also lived to bury his wives. Nefertari, the beloved first wife for whom the sun shone, died around his 24th year. Isetnofret, his second principal wife, died sometime after Nefertari. Other wives came and went, at least 8 official consorts, plus an unknown number of lesser wives and concubines, and most of them predeceased the ancient, increasingly frail, but still politically formidable king who sat on the throne year after year, decade after decade, a living monument to the human capacity for physical endurance, the human vulnerability to personal grief, and the human inability to protect the people one loves from the ultimate power of death. The man who wanted to live forever, who carved his name on every surface, who built monuments that were designed to endure for eternity, who presented himself as a god among men and a king among gods. This man watched his children die before him, one by one, year after year, for 6 decades. The greatest builder in human history could not build a barrier against the one force that no monument, no colossus, no fortress, no deep-carved cartouche, and no amount of human ambition or divine favor can ultimately defeat. The relentless, the impartial, and the all-consuming passage of time. The monuments endure, standing in the desert sun, standing in the Nubian cliff face, standing in the museums and the galleries and the public squares of cities that Ramesses could never have imagined, standing as testimony to a human ambition so vast and so comprehensive that 3,000 years of erosion, conquest, neglect, and deliberate destruction have not been able to extinguish it. The children are gone. The 100 sons and daughters who bore the royal blood of the Ramesses dynasty, the princes who were groomed for the throne and who died before they could claim it, the princesses who were married to foreign kings and who disappeared into the courts of distant empires, all gone, their names recorded on the walls of the great tomb KV5 in the Valley of the Kings, but their individual stories largely lost to history. The name survives, carved deep in the stone, carved so deeply that no chisel can remove it, carved so frequently and on so many surfaces that even if every monument were destroyed, the name would still exist in the archaeological record, in the scholarly and historical literature, in the popular imagination of millions of people around the world, in the consciousness of a modern world that recognizes the name Ramesses, even if it cannot name a single other pharaoh. The man behind the name is dust. The mummy of Ramesses II has had its own extraordinary journey through time, a journey that mirrors, in many ways, the pharaoh's own restless ambition and his stubborn refusal to stay in one place. Originally buried in his tomb KV7 in the Valley of the Kings, the mummy was moved at least twice by the priests of the 21st dynasty, first to the tomb of Queen Ahmose in Hapi, then, approximately 70 years later, to the tomb of the high priest Pinerjem II at Deir el-Bahari. The hieroglyphic inscriptions on the linen wrappings of the mummy record the dates and the circumstances of each move. A paper trail, or rather a linen trail, that allows modern scholars to reconstruct the route that the pharaoh's carefully mummified body travelled from its original magnificent resting place to its final, humble, and deliberately concealed hiding place in the royal cache. The mummy was discovered in 1881, was placed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and was transferred in 2021 to the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization as part of the celebrated Pharaoh's Golden Parade, a televised procession that carried the mummified bodies of 22 pharaohs and queens through the streets of Cairo to their new home, accompanied by military honors, orchestral music, and the attention of the international media. The mummy of Ramesses II has had its own extraordinary journey through the modern world, a journey that mirrors, in many ways, the pharaoh's own restless ambition and his stubborn refusal to stay in one place. In 1976, when the mummy was discovered to be deteriorating due to a fungal infection that threatened to destroy the preserved tissues, the body was flown to Paris for conservation treatment at the Musée de l'Homme. The pharaoh was issued a modern Egyptian passport for the journey, listing his occupation as king deceased, and he was received at Le Bourget airport with the full military honors befitting a head of state. The French conservation team spent several months treating the mummy, analyzing its physical condition and documenting the characteristics of the pharaoh whose face had become one of the most recognizable images of the ancient world. The Paris episode is one of the most remarkable moments in the posthumous history of any historical figure, a moment when the modern world paid tribute, with a combination of scientific purpose and ceremonial respect, to a man who had died more than 3,000 years earlier, and whose extraordinary life still had the power to command the attention and the respect of the modern world. The mummy now lies in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo, transferred there in April of 2021 as part of the celebrated Pharaoh's Golden Parade, a procession that carried the mummified bodies of 22 pharaohs and queens through the streets of Cairo to their new home. The face is still there, the hooked nose, the strong jaw, the reddish hair, the face of a man who wanted to be remembered, the face of a man who succeeded, the face of a man who built more, fought more, married more, fathered more, and endured longer than almost any other human being in the entire history of the ancient world. The face of a man who, if the Egyptian theological tradition is to be believed, should be in the afterlife now, should be sailing in the solar bark with the sun god Re, should be feasting in the field of reeds, should be living the eternal life that the spells and the rituals and the magnificent tomb and the beautiful sarcophagus were all designed to guarantee. Instead, the face stares out from behind the glass of a museum case, 32 centuries after his death, still waiting for the eternity he was promised, still commanding the attention of the living, still refusing, with the stubbornness, the ambition, the iron will, and the magnificent, terrifying, heartbreaking determination that defined his entire extraordinary life, to be forgotten, to be consigned to the silence and the anonymity and the second death that the Egyptian theological system warned was the ultimate fate of those whose names were no longer spoken and whose monuments no longer stood. The stone endures, the name survives, the face remains, and the question that the face poses, the question of whether the monuments are sufficient, whether the carved name can carry the spirit, whether the stone can hold the essence of the man who commanded it to be carved, is a question that Ramesses II, the great builder pharaoh, the man who built more than any other human being in history, and who wanted, more than anything else, to live forever, would very much like to know the answer to. But the face behind the glass is silent, impassive, and eternally still. The lips are closed, the eyes do not open, and the eternity that the pharaoh was promised stretches out before him. Not the radiant, God-filled, sun-drenched eternity of the Egyptian afterlife, but the quiet, glass-enclosed, museum-lit eternity of the modern world, where the pharaohs do not live but merely endure, their bodies preserved, their names remembered, their stories told and retold across the millennia, waiting in the silence of their glass cases for the morning that the ancient text promised would come, but that has not, for more than 3,200 years, arrived.